The Tartar Steel chess tournament is just around the corner, starting on the 15th of January in the Netherlands. And going into the event, Magnus Carlsen, world number 1 and current world champion, is the favourite as ever. And one of the reasons he's so astonishingly good and consistent in these tournaments is his ability to squeeze in endgames. He turns draws into wins and losses into draws. And I want to look today at a game that he played against Jan Krzysztof Duda. It was in the Blitz World Championship just played at the end of last year. Magnus had white here, and we'll see just some endgame wizardry as always. So we had this Sicilian on board, and Duda now plays an unusual move with knight to f6, not committing a pawn here, and so allowing white to go e5. Now this is known as the Nimzowitsch variation, and I mention that for a reason, because after e5, knight to d5, Magnus actually plays in a way here where he develops the knight to c3, which is very reminiscent of the Nimzowitsch attack in the Petrov classical line. So you can go pawn to c3 here as white and set up the big centre, but after knight to c3 takes, pawn recaptures, we have this structure which is reminiscent of the line of the Petrov that I just mentioned. And in that line, white's looking to go things like bishop to e3, queen to d2, castles queenside, pawn to h4. You often delay the development of this f1 bishop and attack black on the king side. That's what happens in the Petrov. And I mention all this because we see shades of that in this game. So after knight to c6, now we had pawn to h4 immediately, discouraging black from castling kingside rather, putting some uncomfortable questions to Duda. So pawn to e6 now, and now bishop to f4 developing. It looks nice on this square in this kind of pawn structure rather than e3, so it's a good move. Queen to c7 now from Duda, and this is the whole point. He's a bit uncomfortable to develop the king side and castle this way when he's going into an attack. So instead he looks to develop the queen side first. We had queen to d2 here, now pawn to h6, good move taking away this critical square. Now bishop to d3 from Magnus. It looks slightly strange to block the queen's line like this, but because of this advanced d5 pawn, the bishop can find a nice home here, so you're okay, you're not running into c4 or anything. We had pawn to b6 now, Duda continues with the queenside development. Bishop to e4 and bishop to b7 hitting that diagonal. And now Magnus is really positionally astute here. So if you get a bit casual and castle, which is a move you want to play, then you allow black to play this knight e7 move, and you're looking to come into this d5 square. Say the bishop's chop, queen recaptures. The difference here is that if you play c4, the difference to what was played in the game, taking away this d5 square, now black has b5 undermining that pawn. And there's no knight d2 because the queen sits on that square. And if you go queen d3, well this isn't good because the knight's hitting d5, you're opening the b line. If I run this all back, the reason this is an important variation is that if we come to this position here, Magnus plays c4, excellent move. Because now if you try knight e7, this square is already covered. So in this variation here, now we can play queen d3, preventing b5. And if you prepare it with a6, now we can castle, b5, and knight d2 comes just in time because the queen has moved. Really deep stuff, but it's just a nice variation to show how these super GMs, they don't sleepwalk into anything. So c4 first instead of castles. Now we had this knight into a5 move, opening the knight like that, hitting the c4 pawn. Magnus chops here, and here I think Duda should take with the queen to allow the knight to then come back to c6. Instead he takes with the knight, which looks a bit ugly because that knight's not really going anywhere at the moment. And after castles he plays queen c6, so these pieces are actually in the opposite order here. So we had queen to c3 now from Magnus, opening the line of the rook. Also looking in this direction we note, so it prevents any kind of d6 push here which the knight was supporting, because then you've got some tactical problems. So bishop to e7 now, and rook to d3 prepares to double. So really nice from Magnus, he's keeping control here, but it gets kind of crazy now after queen to e4. This is a rapid game, remember. So the bishop is hit here, pawn g3 defends. Now we have knight to a5 attacking this pawn twice with queen and knight. And you could play pawn to b3 here, play it a bit more slowly with moves like king to b1 and that kind of thing. But Magnus really mixes it up now. So he plays rook h to d1, counter-attacking this pawn. Black decides to defend that one, which does seem a good idea. Now we had knight to d2, hitting the queen, hitting the pawn. Queen f5 is a good move, drops back here and keeps some threats in the position. So if you play too casually as white, say you go king to b1 here for some prophylaxis, well now g5 comes. Because the knight has left this square and the rook has left the h-file, this move is now possible. So because of this threat, Magnus doesn't go king b1, he goes rook to f3, eyeing the queen down this line. And here we had knight back into c6. Good move from Duda because it sets up tactics. So watch this. Bishop takes on h6, uncovering the attack on the queen. And if you want to think about what you would play here as black, then please do so. And if you're enjoying this video, smash that subscribe button to never miss another. And thanks very much for the support. So knight d4 comes from Duda. What is going on here? Well, if you take the rook here, the queen, sorry, with your rook, now knight e2 check comes. The king has to come to b1, and this is critical. You take here with check. After the pawn recaptures, you pick up the rook. White can take this one here, but after rook h7, that bishop's going to have to retreat, let's say to f6. That's the best move. Chop, chop, and ultimately black is coming out an exchange ahead. So really tricky stuff from Duda. But Magnus saw all this, and he didn't play this line with taking the queen on f5. Instead, he comes up with the brilliant queen takes on d4. Now if black captures the queen, we take here once again. The pawn recaptures, we take here. But this time it's different because after rook h7, bishop to f6, whoops, we have this exchange, and this is a very different game because after say rook h6, knight f3, white has a lot of compensation for the exchange. And we'll see a very similar variation to this in the game actually. So instead of taking the queen on d4, Duda took the rook on f3. We had knight recaptures, pawn takes here, bishop captures here, rook h7, bishop f6. This is all fairly forced stuff. The pawn recaptures here. Now rook h6 prepares to pick up that pawn. You can't delay too long or g4, g5 comes. The knight takes in the centre. The rook captures here. Now pawn to f4, that one was attacked. The king slides up to e7 to prepare to activate this rook, make the king a bit better. And now rook to d3 from Magnus, just improving that rook, keeping an eye on this pawn, turning the move over to black. And I'll briefly pause here because if we do a material count, we can see that white has 7 pawns, black has 5. So even though black has the exchange, white does have enough compensation. So rook to c8 comes, pawn to b3 defends, rook to g6 attacks this one, but knight e2 hops back and gives it defense. So after the other one doubles, that pawn is covered. Now Magnus can activate the king with king to d2. And we're going to see another one of his beautiful squeezes here, just like a boa constrictor, destroying his opponent. Pawn to d6 now from Duda, pawn to a4 from Magnus, and pawn to e5. So this is the idea. Duda wants to rip open lines, get some lines for his rook. But rook to f3 comes, a nice waiting move. This is still 0-0 on a computer, but Magnus has all the play here. And you can't take the pawn to immediately open lines, or after rook recaptures, the knight still holds the pawn, and these ones are just going to be a bit weak down the line. If you imagine a knight sitting on c5, d5 at the right moment, because the king defends this one, there's so many plans for white here. So rook to g4 was tried, king to e3. Now we had king to e6, king to f2. Magnus completes this journey of holding this g2 pawn, g3, and now the rook is freed up, you see. So rook 8 to g7, rook to e3, king to f5, stepping out of the pin, rook to d3 now, just eyeing this pawn, and the king steps back to defend, and this is the problem. Magnus can just keep probing away, it's completely his position. Rook to d5 now, rook to g8, king to f3, And now Duda changes the pawn structure with pawn to a6, which does set up an immediate shot of pawn to f5. After takes, rook takes here. Magnus was probably a bit hesitant to go for this because you could have, say, rook 4 to g6, holding this pawn. You're starting to open some lines. It could get a bit tricky with activating the black king. Still good for white though. Both players are short on time, however, so Magnus goes for something a bit cleaner. Rook to d1, he just waits a move. Now king to e7, and now pawn to f5. And black is getting almost zugzwanged here because there's threats to go f6 and then pick up on d6. The knight can remaneuver into e4. So we had the rook drop back to g7. Now this rook came back to d5. And the king came into f6 now, but even if you try something like, say, rook to d8 to hold this pawn, well, now knight c3 comes, and coming into e4 it's just deadly. So we had king f6 instead. Duda goes for counterplay here, takes with check, king captures, rook takes on b6, and Magnus just has way too many pawns now, plus he's so active with the pieces. Rook to g6 seeks to trade, but pawn a5, very powerful move. You can't take here, or after captures, these connected pawns will be winning the day. So rook to d8, let's use that open file. But Magnus now finds an awesome tactic to cleanly win the game. Do pause if you want to see how you can take advantage of this king. So pawn to g4 check. There was a couple other good moves, but this one's nice. The rook captures, knight g3, and here you're forced to give up the rook. So it captures here, king takes, pawn to e4, and rook takes on a6. And it may look scary for a beginner player. Black's got the passed pawn, the rook's kind of active, but for these super GMs, this is just a piece of cake. So king to e5, rook to b6 now. Let's free up the way for this pawn. Rook to g8 check, the king steps back, pawn to f5. And now pawn to a6, white's just so much faster than these connected ones, plus the king is well placed to blockade them. So we had king to f4 now, rook to e6, preventing this e3 push, really nice move. Rook to g7 here, eyeing this square, pawn to c5, rook to d7. Now you can go king e2, but rook to d6 is nice. The rook moves away, rook to d4, again preventing the push of this pawn. King e5, rook a4 now, so that one was multi-purpose too. It comes behind this pawn. f4 from Duda, desperately trying to drum something up, but after pawn to a7, e3 check, king f1, king d5, that was the final move of the game. Magnus took the victory. So watch out for the Magnus Endgame squeeze in this Tartar Steel tournament. If you enjoyed this game, then do click here to subscribe to the channel, and see another epic game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.